we're gonna, everybody stay kind of on the call here. We're gonna kind of move over to kind of a panel discussion. We did one of these at the last event. I think it went pretty well. We're definitely still, I said earlier today, this is still training wheels. We're still trying to figure out our formats, what systems work well, what don't. So this is kind of conversational for our last 45 minutes or so. And this topic, for our guests that are going to join us, they're kind of hearing this somewhat cold, somewhat on purpose. I wanted to get fresh ideas. I didn't want a doctoral dissertation here. I wanted some kind of off the cuff spitballing, brainstorming. About 2.5 years ago, I was having a beer with a friend, and I started talking about this idea of risk space versus safe space. And I used to stutter, so that's really hard for me to say those things over and over and over again. So I'm going to refer to them as risk and safe from now on. But it was the idea that at the time seemed kind of novel, and now it feels like it's been somewhat proven that there's hundreds of companies on the far end of the spectrum that are as risky as they can be. They are, they're in the startup phase. They don't have the things that Laura described, right? They don't have traction. They don't have cash. Maybe they have some experience. Maybe they don't. But they have a vision, right? And they're going to risk everything they've got on that vision. That's at the risky side. On the safe side of it, completely different. It's the Lockheeds and the Boeings that don't do anything at all without a purchase order. They don't do anything without a purchase order. So everything that they do, every bolt that they assemble, every widget that they craft is covered by a government contract somewhere along the lines. And that's the spectrum, right? Risk versus safe. And then over time, a lot of the risky companies fail, maybe appropriately. I've already described my own history. Our company failed. A lot of those risky companies failed, but some of them grow. And some of them evolve from, for example, Blue Origin and SpaceX started out pretty risky. And then over time, they got a couple $100 million worth of government contracts, and then they became less risky, right? They became safe-ish. Other companies like Made in Space, same story. They started out as a Singularity University program, just a couple of grad kids. And then over time, they grew their widget, they got better at it. And last year they were sold for some random number, but probably in the $300, $400 million range is my personal guess. I don't have any insight or knowledge about that. But they used their contracts for NASA to attract a very, deep-pocketed suitor. And last year, there were 5 different companies that did that. Boston Dynamics, after they got bought by Google and then got sold by Google, they re-got by, I think it's Toyota, a Japanese company, I forget, I think it's Toyota. Made in Space, Tethers Unlimited, and the biggest exit was a $4.4 billion contract or merger with Aerojet Rocketdyne. So this idea of risk space evolving to safe space, currently the only path for this that is proven is get government contracts. The closer you get into this side of the spectrum, the more likely you are to be purchased. So that's really great. We all want to get that exit, right? They always used to refer to that Netscape moment when Netscape proved that the internet was actually a real business because the investors got to exit. Well, so we haven't seen that yet, and I'm not going to count Virgin in that box just yet, because that's kind of an anomaly. Maybe there's going to be some others follow it. Certainly, Momentous is going that route, but there are the beginnings of some exits. But currently, the only real examples that we can point to of companies that have grown from the risky side, evolved to an exit, are companies with government contracts, big 50 million, 100 million plus government contracts. I'm not aware of any exits of any companies that haven't gone through that evolution. So this is a conversation between y'all and some of our guests. I'd be happy to. Thank you, Natasha, for pointing out it's Hyundai, not Toyota. Thank you for that clarification. That's correct. But I want to have this conversation because I think this risk space versus safe space conversation is somewhat new. We all of us that have been at this for a long time have been referring to new space for 20 years now. It ain't new anymore. We have to have a new name for this hybrid environment that we're in. So that's what I'm going to say. Those are kind of my opening comments. Let's just kind of have a chat session about the environment that we're in, right? We've got Tom on one end of the spectrum saying, look, let's go start some new companies. You got Laura on the other end of the spectrum saying, well, you know what? Let's watch for red flags because there are a lot of them. And then you've got Gary, who's out there actively trying to raise capital now. That's like, all right, we're trying to do something that's manageable, but we're still at that aspirational side. And we haven't gotten the contracts to be at the safe side. So that's my preamble. Anybody want to jump in and just, start riffing off of this conversation?
Okay, let me rip you right away, Michael. Let me
just
go right out there. Okay, because it's not just I want to start new companies. I want to start new companies in every kind of industry, not just launch. I mean, you're talking about, in a lot of cases when you're talking about risk versus safe space, you're talking mostly launch companies. Let's just put it out there. When you're talking about Lockheed Martin versus somebody else. Because we've talked about this a lot. We've talked about how different companies might come in on the risk side, and as they get the contracts, they start going toward the safe side later, and they're trying to chart that on a graph, and we're trying to actually find some real numbers to back up our assertions. I was thinking about it just today, as a matter of fact. I was thinking about it, and we were talking about how SpaceX, for example, might have started out risky and then started going more toward the safe side. And now that I think about it, and I looked at the history of that, which we were all witness to, I would raise the question whether or not actually, in some respects at least, SpaceX almost started as a safe space company and got more risky as they made more money. Because you realize he got some private investment. Yes, he put in his own money at first, but then he immediately got into the COTS program. Right. Now, COTS is Commercial Orbital Transportation Service. That was run by a good buddy of mine, Dennis Stone, at NASA, and they were throwing money at launch companies to try to develop a commercial model. But part of it is, well, we're going to help you with this commercial model, and we can match X number of dollars that you raise. So he goes out and raises $500 million from canny investors, and then COTS matched it. So he started out with some some safe space side. When he was first doing all his tests with Falcon 1 and early Falcon 9, he was blowing up rockets all over the place. That was funded by a Department of Defense contract to, test launch a satellite for that. And I remember when that thing finally launched in 2008, I was in Glasgow for IAC, and we were all, SpaceX was there big time. We were all partying at the local pub and screaming, because they finally got one into orbit. It was the greatest thing. But that kept going. That contract led to more contracts. Next thing they're launching all sorts of stuff for the military. And then they're launching all sorts of stuff for NASA. And then they're doing the supply runs to ISS. And now they're launching humans to the ISS. So all of that has been on Uncle Sam's dime. And only after he profited mightily from that, they turn around and say, oh yeah, I want to build Starship. Now, Starship is truly more of a risk-based program. I haven't heard any announcements that he's made any major contract deals, public or private, for that thing yet. This is still in test mode, but that's truly a risk-based operation. But he started out very much so in safe space and then moved to risk space when he built up the bank account to do it.
Right.
Anyone.
I was literally there when Musk was having his conversation with, at the time, General Pete Worden. He hadn't left the Air Force. He hadn't joined to be a center administrator for NASA, NASA Ames. And they were deep in huddle conversations about we need a contract from the Air Force. So yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Y'all, Laura, Gary, got any comments?
Go ahead, Lauren.
There's something about the premise of this conversation that is off for me. So I think that all space is risky. And I think that the way that we look at it is different. I think that whether you're talking about a slow and steady program, a traditional government program, or whether you're talking about a crazy ambitious idea, it's all risky because there's still all these challenges within space, and you're never going to go into space at all if you are risk adverse. The only way to stay safe is to stay on the ground. And I'm speaking as someone who's had facilitated payloads that have exploded on launches. So it's a challenge when you're thinking about this, because I don't think that anything is safe in space. I think that the reason why we do it is because there's a little bit of that adrenaline rush, that because we're pushing it, we know that we can fail. And I'm not talking about business failure in this aspect, although that adds to it. I'm talking about just things blowing up or things not working once it gets up there, like that Sirius satellite that just launched. So there's always risk in space. And I'm trying to imagine what a safe space looks like. I can't picture it. Maybe you all can help me figure out what that even might be. Because even if we're talking about like a slow and steady government program, let's take SLS. Very slow. That's
as slow as it could be.
Yeah, very, very cautious, right? It's still has the risk of breaking. We just saw that test run where it failed on the test run. So, that failure could still happen in space. So the Orion capsule, the power backup, they've decided not to replace the backup. So it's not going to have that power redundancy. That's a risk, right? When you're talking about human lives, putting humans in the Boeing Starliner, these are more traditional, less risky maybe, but it's still very, very risky. So what does that even look like, safe space? I don't know how to imagine that.
I think the distinction you guys are actually making is about who the customer is more than whether it's safe or risky. Because I think your point is good, Laura, that like all this stuff is risky, right? But the inherent assumption is that the government contract is safer, or that like a big defense contractor like Lockheed, maybe they have a diversified portfolio of revenues and that's why it's safer. That's not their only thing that they're working on. But it seems like that's really a distinction to make. And it reminds me of another related topic, which is, I think it's related anyway, which is there are certain endeavors that we want to get to get this future of like a robust industrial space economy, in orbit, space to space business, and not where we are right now. And there's kind of a gap as to how do we get from here to there strictly off of commercial business without, how much government contract or support or anchor customer kind of behavior needs to be part of the mix to bridge that divide from where we are now to building that, infrastructure baseline so that then there can be, a more robust sort of less government driven entrepreneurial kind of economy in space. And I think there's the first customers for a lot of these things, especially like the infrastructure type of projects, like what we're trying to do, are probably going to be government contracts. And we're going to be looking at grant support and that sort of thing to develop the technology early on. It's not going to be strictly from, I don't expect it to be strictly from, commercial customers in the beginning.
I agree with you that customers matter, but I want to push back a little bit because government's not safe either. How many people on this call maybe have been, had suddenly a contract by the government cut or a promise contract like being withdrawn? I know a lot of people are still burned by previous experiences of governments changing priorities and something is canceled. And you were relying on that money, right? So government doesn't necessarily mean safe either.
No, I don't mean to say that it's safe at all. Don't get me wrong. No, governments, especially, in a democracy like the United States, you have changing governments in power, and priorities change and programs change all the time. So yeah, certainly you can lose those contracts. I just mean that if you're talking about the discussion that was delineated in the beginning was safe seems to be the government contractors and risky is the non, but that's actually just two different types of customers, and the riskiness of the endeavor is a different aspect.
Yeah, exactly. That I'm trying to just kind of put in a box that says, granted, right, none of this is easy. You're absolutely right. I wouldn't be doing this if it was easy, right? I mentioned the bagel shop earlier. I didn't build a bagel shop. I wanted to build elevators to the sky, right? So I took the hardest thing I knew was possible as the task I want to accomplish, right? So I went after it because it was so difficult. I guess what I'm curious about is, I think that there's a spectrum of what's acceptable risk. Right? So risk versus, let's like box it a little and say, okay, what's acceptable to investors? What's acceptable to stakeholders? Lila and Tim are going up to the National Congress and saying, we want to develop a lot of infrastructure in space, right? That's their main thing that they're working on. Let's build a lot of infrastructure in space. And so I'm trying to figure out, is the only exitable customer right now a government customer, right? Can you exit if you get, let's take Redwire, made in space, right? They're a pretty good sized company. Can a company like Gary's exit to Redwire without having a government customer? Is it more than just an acquisition of talent and IP? Wow,
I think it depends on how far we've developed the customer base at that point.
But is your customer base in space to another XYZ company like a Momentous, or is your customer one way or the other a government? And you don't have to answer that if that's an inappropriate question, right? But I'm saying, like, is the government the only customer big enough to justify an exit? Or can you have a different, smaller customer and still get exited out?
I think it depends on scale. If you have enough of those commercial customers or smaller customers, it's like any other business. If the investors see an opportunity to buy future revenues or technology that can drive future growth for their business, then they'll see you as an exit opportunity. It doesn't matter. I don't think it matters if the customer is government or if it's private. It only matters if that customer base is seen to be growing.
But is there a private customer? I'm not
Well,
aware of one.
Right. I mean, at the moment, I think that is an underdeveloped area, which is why I think government customers are going to play a critical role in the beginning.
So
telecom is basically-
Inar is talking about, oh, sorry, just hang on a second, Tom. Inar is talking about how the government pork barrel can dry up fast. And Leah is talking about how do you ensure this stuff? If there's only one ultimate end customer right now, both of those are really big red flags, to use Laura's words earlier. If there's only one customer, and if the environment is kind of uninsurable, how do we get from here where we are to where we want to go?
I think it
Tom.
depends on the company. Sorry, I can think already of Virgin Galactic. They went public in 2019 and they did have small government contracts, but that wasn't their main customer base. It was the general public, the wealthy public, I should say, the people who had signed up over 500 or 600 or 700, depending on the time period, of number of customers, plus the additional people who signed up for the one small step deposit. So those are the reasons, those customers, those, diversification of customers is the reason why I think Virgin Galactic chose to go public, aside from needing the money. So I think it really depends on what the company's customer, what their market looks like, who they're looking at. Because if it's like lunar mining, your only customer there right now is government. It may be in the future it'll be diversified, but it's not. So I think it really just depends on the company.
Awesome. Lee has a specific question to Gary about space debris. Is it owned by the entity that put it there? She's saying it is, and it is owned by the company the entity that put it there. So how do you get released, or does it become public domain once it becomes debris?
Yeah, I think the law is pretty clear on this right now, that the launching state is responsible for any object they launch into orbit until it disappears. And so what we don't know, thinking forward into when we would be processing debris in the future, once we process it, presumably that, would be considered as releasing that liability, because now it's been converted, it's been destroyed and converted into something else. But at the moment, any object, they hold liability for it. Now, if it's a private company that put it up there, presumably they have liability for it, but really it's the governments that are, supervising their activities and the ones that ultimately hold the bag if something happens.
Right. Dr. Adams is asking, can we envision SpaceX spinning off Starlink? Now, if anybody's been on this call last month and the month before, we like talking about Starlink, right? We've referenced it as the Starlink singularity. I personally have said, I don't know if we can have a good crystal ball about what happens when Starlink comes online at the levels that they're planning.
Wait, Starlink or Starship, you mean?
Good point. I was referencing Starship. Rob is asking about Starlink. There's too many stars in this star. So his specific question is, can we envision SpaceX spinning off Starlink? Whether or not Elon plans to or not, that would be an exit.
It has been rumored, right? Like a number of times that they would spin it off and IPO Starlink separately to fund the colonization of Mars or something.
While I don't have a lot of admiration for Musk, I do have a lot of admiration for the person who actually runs that company, Gwen Shotwell. And Shotwell said she has implied that they might spin that off. So I would love to see that. I think that would be maybe our actual Netscape moment. So fingers crossed on that one. Does anybody want to make any predictions about what 2021 looks like in financial predictions of companies, right? We know that Momentous is going to go and issue an SPAC. How's that going to go? How's that? You know, they're definitely in the risk space category as far as I'm concerned. They have a few clients. They actually have clients that are not all government customer clients. So that's a super important distinction. I'm watching that one pretty carefully. Anybody have any thoughts on Momentous and their SPACs?
Not just Momentous, but it looks like Firefly might be going in that route as well. So we've been
Oh,
looking at my
I hadn't
company's
heard that.
looking at, yeah, we've been looking at SPACs for a few months now, and it looks like it's a growing trend, not just within the space industry, but you know, in the financial markets as well. And so I can definitely foresee a lot of those really high capital companies that are sort of on the verge of becoming operational, going towards that route. And I don't know if I can predict, you know, Momentous versus Firefly versus some of the others that are talking about it or have already done it, but it's risky. It's risky because they are pre-revenue, as far as I know, and therefore you never quite know how long it's going to take. Like with Virgin Galactic, how long it's going to take for them to actually become commercially operational. But as we've seen with Virgin, it's gone very well with them because people are buying into that. Their ticker is SPCE, right? They're buying into that base ticker, and I think that is very hot right now. I don't know if that's going to go well in the end, but hey, it's going hot right now, so I can't complain.
You know, Laura, do you know a lot about these SPACs? I don't even know how to pronounce it. I don't know that much about this other than I'm reading the headlines. So do you know that much about it? Do you want to talk? Do you want to educate us a little?
I'm no expert. I just know what other people have written recently about it to get myself on board. And so someone else who's more of an expert might want to chime in, but it is an alternate way. It's a merger of a company that was previously set up for the purpose of merging with a promising company. And that initial company sort of gets that funding secure. And then the newer company, whether, you know, it's Momentous or whatever company, once they merge, they are publicly traded. And so it's an alternate way of going IPO, essentially.
Yep. And I would add one more interesting piece about SPACs is that these are not new. They've been around for a while, and they were previously called blank check companies, which has a pretty negative connotation if you think about it, which is probably why they rebranded themselves as SPACs. But you know, these are the unique feature about a SPAC is that the money is raised in an IPO on the original entity with no distinction about what it's going to invest in, just sort of like a broad category. So people buy these based upon the person or the personalities or the entities that are offering them. And it is now, as I understand, become popular for any and every celebrity to open their own SPAC because they can just go off of the force of their name to do this IPO. And they have this pile of money, and as far as I know, there's some sort of expiration date usually with the SPAC too. So they have to make an investment in something, which really adds some fuel to sort of the potential overheating of capital flowing from these things into ideas. Because if you got this money that's just looking for a target, needs to be deployed somewhere, maybe it gets a little bit less critical in its thinking. But at that point, they don't care because that's sort of their own exit. So it's a lot of hype that fuels these, I think.
Well, so in case anybody doesn't know, Gary's background, he is a chartered financial analyst. So this is like one of his areas. So thanks for that clarification, sir. Appreciate that. A couple of years, 2 years ago, initial coin offerings were all in vogue where they would come up with a new cryptocurrency, hype, pull in buckets of money. Some people became enormously wealthy, and most of those ICOs evaporated, right? So
shocked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of wondering if SPACs are going to go the way of cryptocurrency ICOs. If you have any insight into that.
I mean, they did last time. That's sort of the previous round of blank check companies. They were given a bad name because they were used by, sort of seedy people to just scam people out of their money.
Yikes.
in a lot of cases. Now, I'm not saying that that's what these are. They've acquired a veneer of like legitimacy now, based upon, I don't know if it's the people who have been doing them and authoring them, or if it's the companies they're investing in, but they've certainly moved into a more acceptable lane, right? Whether it goes the way of the ICOs, well, I hope not, but I mean, the thing with these things is I feel the market it seems really hot right now for investment in space and many other speculative areas through these types of vehicles and even just direct offerings. And I sure hope that it lasts for a little while anyway, but it's impossible to know when the party's going to end with this stuff. That's the thing about any, bubble. So,
Tom?
Yes.
I thought you were going to say something.
I had a comment I want to make way back. We're so beyond that conversation now.
Sorry. Well, so let's bring you in though. Like you've been at this a while. Kudos to the gray hair, right? I'm getting there, but
yeah. You still have more than I do though, so it's not
this. We've never seen this before. We have wanted to see this for a long time, but this industry is evolving. It's evolving very quickly. Heck, Laura just said a moment ago about a deal that I normally would have normally been on my radar, but wasn't. I missed it. There are so many things happening in this industry right now. It's actually hard to keep up with it. So, you were one of the earliest pioneers at the Space Frontier Foundation. You've been beating the drum about commercial space development for basically 20 years, maybe a little more. What are your near-term predictions, right?
Well, it's easy and it's hard at the same time, because back then, as you say, I in a way, I'm feeling a little vindicated now, because we did, and you saw me do it. We were trying to initiate something in terms of an exchange-traded fund to do different types of space-related investments. And we just found out at the time, we just didn't have the tools to do it right. It took another 15 years before those tools were finally developed. But thanks to a whole bunch of new technologies, not the least of which was Title III of the Jobs Act, you can bootstrap a space-related company just on a crowdfunding platform. You can get your first million that way. It's just equity crowdfunding. It's perfectly legal. And those kinds of things, we had those things in mind, but just couldn't do them. There's just no legal or technical infrastructure to make that happen. But now it's happening all over the place. So the question now is, and this is where analysts like Laura come in, is that, okay, now that it's there, now that there are players in the game, they have to be analyzed and judged cruelly, just as every other player has been in the market game for 100 years. Mm-hmm. And so this is where we are now. What fun we're going to have.
Laura, that's your new tagline. We judge cruelly.
I prefer realistically, I'm actually an optimist. I'm a huge space fan. But when I talk about, companies in an analytical way, we need to be realistic about it. And I don't think that's cruel. I think that's just fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring something to the table with that background in physics too, right? That, are what they're doing is what the company XYZ proposing actually within the bounds of physics? Like, let's start there and then figure out if their finances make sense, right? But let's start with, can you actually do what you say you're going to do? I find that a lot of people don't necessarily use that as their starting point.
Well, yeah, back in the early days, when we were first starting to do even a business track, just a business-related track at a major conference like ISDC, which we helped pioneer. A lot of the guys' initial presentations, it was all about the sexiness of it. It was all basic, it's space. Space is cool.
It is cool.
Give us money. Don't ask
That's how a
uncomfortable
guy like
questions.
that's how a guy like Reverend Rick got the nickname Reverend Rick.
Yes,
right?
that's exactly it.
But for those of y'all don't know, I have a lot of respect for Rick Tomlinson, but he has a very strong oratorial style, and he is the Reverend because of it. So yeah, you could just go out there, and we were guilty of it, right? We had some super cool PowerPoints and some nice videos about what a space elevator was going to look like, right? I have a bunch of books and trophies and robots, and we did real things. And at the end, it was it didn't work, right? What we tried to do didn't work. And so you can get a long ways on hand waving, but at some point, physics and finance have to meet. And that's what I'm trying to get to is, right, what is this spectrum? We can't call it new space anymore. That's over. We just have to just declare that, 2021, there is no such thing as new space, but we don't have a new label for it. I'm trying to come up with a label, which is why I'm talking about this hybrid of risk versus safe. But we have to come up with a new label for this thing that we're doing, because it's not all government. It's not all big companies, and the little companies definitely need some help, but they're not helpless, right? They're not on their own. So somewhere along this way, we have to come up with a new set of language to describe the environment that we're in. 2021 is really different than 2001 when I started all this. So I would like us to kind of craft some new language. And again, it goes back to what Lila and Tim are doing. They have to have new language to go in front of their respective Congress folks at the Capitol and say, look, we have a credible plan. This is what we're trying to do, but we're using language that doesn't work anymore to describe this new thing. And so I'm hearing honest feedback on risk space versus safe space, but we have to have a new language. So I'm open to options here. Nothing. No one else seems to have an answer either. I don't have an answer on this.
Well, I was trying to kick some ideas in my head. They just don't seem to work. I wanted to call it like emergent space or emerging space or something along those lines. And that just doesn't quite feel right. So I don't know.
I mean, for the very beginning of it, I don't know how far along the stretch is, but I always sort of liked the term entrepreneurial space, and I forget who coined that one. I'd read it from someone else a couple of years ago, but I guess that would differentiate from like a Lockheed, but that doesn't mean they can't necessarily be entrepreneurial if they want to be. They just typically don't move like that. But so I don't know if that works either.
Yeah.
I personally use the term emerging space. It's not perfect, but it does
Sorry?
the job. I don't like space like 2.0. I don't like those kinds of phrases,
Right.
just because it's not quantitative. It doesn't really describe anything. So I think, I don't even know if we need a label. Do we really need a label for what we're talking about?
Well, I believe that we do, because the alternative is new space. And that one, I think that one's a dinosaur. I think that one doesn't do us, I don't think that serves our industry well.
Saying new space is also a label, and it did its job, but we don't really have a label anymore. There's blurred edges here. So I think we need to recognize the new reality of these blurs.
So we just call it space from now on? New space is, the king is dead, long live the king.
I mean, there's another distinction that might need to be made. At some point, I don't think that everything that happens, in space is going to be lumped together in one industry, because space is really a segment of many industries and different activities that are happening. And so, at some point, you're just doing an industry, like you're doing manufacturing and your market is in space, instead of on Earth. But it's still manufacturing industry, right? And it has different conditions and everything. So maybe it's space manufacturing, but I think there will be a segmentation of the new space companies, and different risks accrue to those different segments as well. depending on what the market
I think
is.
you made a really good point there, Gary, that it's in space. You have a company, comma, that is in space. And I think that's the label that's needed. We do need a label. We need something to be able to define it in 1 second or less for a soundbite. But I think you're right that until we are able to define it as just another place we are, nobody is an ocean company. Nobody is a
Right.
company unless they're like an actual mountain removal company. But you are just a company in space.
Right. Your mining company or whatever. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we're there yet. I don't really think we are, but I think it's going to be there at some point here.
Yeah, but we have to be able to go to Capitol Hill next week.
There's some urgency behind this terminology request.
Right. Sorry, Tim, you're shaking your head. What?
No, I'm saying like we are using the terminology of in space as just another terrain feature, although we're not on Terra in space, whatever.
Yeah.
Give me a better word for terrain and I'll use that. But yeah, no, that's what we're using is just in space as another way to describe things that are done there.
Okay. Any last comments, y'all? We're going to turn it over to Lila and Tim to close out the day. Do y'all want to say any last comments? Anything we missed?
I actually had a curiosity from the group, and I don't know if there's enough time to dive into this at all, but
We have some flex here.
We talked about SPACs, but we didn't really talk about, the Voyager Space, Redwire, some of these other firms that I think are relatively, this is sort of a new thing that I didn't notice a couple of years ago. Certainly Voyager, I don't know exactly what Redwire's, model is, but I've read a little bit about Voyager Space's model and understand that they, they're acquiring a majority stake in the companies they acquire, but not all the company. So they're leaving some with the entrepreneur, and they're trying to build up like a portfolio of capabilities with the recognition that all of these capabilities will have a long time horizon, and the traditional venture capital with its short time horizon doesn't really suit those types of investments. But if we can get with those pieces all in one bucket together forward across the finish line, then it's very valuable. So they're going to go public as a group or whatever. And it sort of introduces this patient capital that has made, I think, fundraising for longer term endeavors in space more challenging up until this point. And also it creates exits, which is, a good feature for investors to see happen. So I'm curious what the panel thinks about that or others.
Well, so Redwire is funded by a family office that's in very good shape. I have not been able to dig further than very good shape, although I am looking for that. But Natasha actually, puts this in the chat about how they are acquiring kind of, some companies and then bolting on others to, in acquisitions to build up a larger capability for that organization. Voyager did the same thing. I forget the company that bought Tethers, right. I'm trying to come up with the name of the company that bought Tethers.
It's a similar kind of thing, right?
Yeah, right. So that's why I was kind of like, there is a trend here. There's only a few, in the end of maybe 4, maybe 5, but it's
They're
there
growing.
and it's new. Yeah. So that kind of acquisition, bolting everything together and then building something. I wonder if that company goes public someday in the future. I kind of suspect not. But
I mean, Voyager, Dylan Taylor said Voyager was planning to go public in the next couple of years.
Okay. All right.
So at least there's one of them that's announced it. But.
Okay. Well, that would be good. I would like to see that. Anybody else? The last comments? Emergent. Thank you, Emily. Emergent.
I wanted to say something real quick. I'm Debbie Nelson. I'm from Nixing Publishing. I've been kind of quiet. I've been quietly listening, and I can't seem to get my video to go. So let's see.
You've been at both of our 2 other events, correct?
Yes,
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. We appreciate that.
absolutely. Here I
When
am.
this is over, I'd like to
Looking
chat
forward to
because
the
you're
page.
not in my normal circles. I'd like to know why you're here. So thank
Oh,
you
sure.
for coming. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that I think it's really important that we have terminology that everyone finds consistent, because as this grows, and it's going to exponentially, it'll really help to be able to have the communication that we need between different entities if we have some kind of some kind of terminology figured out what we want to call things. Like right now when we're chatting, it's not so much as important to have anything distinct, but as it grows, I think it's really going to make a big difference. And I've seen charts of space terminology throughout the years and how it has to be defined. Yeah. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Terrific. Thank you. I definitely agree. It is time, y'all. It is, by my clock, 12:45. So it's 3:45 where Tim's at. So Lila, Tim, it's your show. I'm going to say thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. For my panelists, thank you. Those are very insightful comments. I'm going to try and incorporate them. And for my part, I'd love to see y'all back here tomorrow. We're going to start at the same time. Tomorrow is going to be, I think, a pretty fascinating conversation. Lots of DoD people, and DoD people don't normally join programs and projects like this. So it is really nice to have that, and to have 3-star General, Lieutenant General Saltzman to conclude our event tomorrow is really amazing. So thanks to the Space Force Association for setting that in motion. And I'd love to have you all here tomorrow as we keep talking about strategic space. So I'm out. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.